You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
What's interesting about the shift from an industrial age to a technological age is that we keep inventing new media: movies, records, radio, television, the internet, and now ebooks. And one of the things that's most interesting about the invention of a new medium is watching it reinvent itself as it penetrates the culture. That is a quote by David Gerald, American science fiction writer and novelist. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the only podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. I'm your host, Rich, and I'd like to thank you all for your reviews, particularly the latest 5-star one on iTunes. And I'd also like to give a big shout out to our TDP community members. The TDP community is our bespoke social media network where we hold events, chat on forums, and connect with other members interested in the study of war and warfare. Now, in the intro, I mentioned the use of new media to engage audiences in discussions about national security issues. I myself have dabbled in this a little bit, but I thought I might talk to someone who has spent the better part of the past decade running a podcast focusing on driving these discussions. With that, my guest today is Mick Cook. Mick Cook is an Australian writer and digital content producer. He is passionate about using strategic communication and creative practices to drive key conversations on social issues and improve professional development programs. He has produced several podcasts, including the Dead Prussian podcast and War for Idiots. Mick is a director of Discover, Create, Learn, a business that provides bespoke professional development programs to assist employers in developing their workforce. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. In this role, he is using strategic communication and creative practice theory to support self-guided learning programs. And in 2019, Mick won the Futuro Sessional Academic Award for teaching in the Communications and Media undergraduate program at the University of Canberra. Now, Mick has also spent 18 years as an artillery officer in the Australian Regular Army. During his time in service, he fulfilled roles in information warfare, strategic communication, and joint fires. And Mick is also a member of the University of New South Wales Defence Research Institute, where he connects academics with the defence community to enable capability outcomes through groundbreaking research. Mick Cook, welcome. Welcome to your show. And thanks for coming on the show to talk about yourself on your show. Well, you're very welcome. Now, Mick, before we start discussing the use of new media to discuss national security issues, I'm interested in understanding what motivated you to study war and warfare.
Well, Rich, that's a very well crafted question. I guess it started maybe I was interested in war and warfare and history. I studied history in high school, but I joined the military when I was 18. Went to the Australian Defence Force Academy, studied a history and English communication degree, and most of my history studies were on either social issues or military studies, military history, and I found it really interesting, but also really hard going. An undergraduate studying in Clausewitz is not exactly a fun time, but it kept me interested enough for me to maintain a passion reading about different types of warfare. Big fan of ancient warfare. The conflicts that the ancient empire of Rome, both the Republic and the imperial empires, how they went into their conquest of the Mediterranean and then the wider world. Was very, very interesting, but it wasn't what I'd call a passion until after I'd been to war and understood, some of the things that I was going through and also not understanding them. And I actually signed up to do a postgraduate degree in strategy and security studies whilst I was in the middle of Afghanistan from a fob using the internet. So luckily I signed up for when I returned from the war, so I'd actually have time to do the study. But it was this experience in war that drove it as a passion for me to study it. Now, most military professionals would call it their passion. and I was interested in it, but I really wanted to get down to understanding it. And it was more than history for me. I needed to do a contemporary strategy type degree to try and understand where war was at and where it had come from. Unfortunately, it also meant studying Clausewitz again. And again, I found it difficult and dense to get into that material. But that's kind of where the passion was really stoked. So it was an interest, and as a professional military officer, it was always an interest, like it always is. But the passion about it came really from that experience in Afghanistan, trying to understand the war I was a part of, the causes of that war. And a good example is we were based in a place called Lashkar, which I've been told means army camp, because it's where Alexander's armies camped on their way, pretty much when they got turned by the Bactrians to go down into India. So it's an interesting sort of way to come about it. I'd been a warfighter for nearly 10 years before I really had a passion to really understand war.
It's a really interesting observation that it's this thing that you signed up to be a professional at, to be a leader within. And it isn't until you experience it did you realize how little you knew about it. And then you start studying it. It's quite an amazing sort of outlook on it. And I think something a lot of people could probably reflect on. Mick, your foray into the world of podcasts began with this show, the Dead Prussian podcast. Can you tell our listeners about why you decided to start a podcast about war and warfare?
Yeah, I suppose it's linked obviously to my previous answer, but I was always interested in new media. I studied film and communications when I was at university. In fact, you were there with me studying, and that's a surprise, I suppose, for a lot of our listeners. We've known each other for 2 decades, but I had done some journalism before, and I'd done some film and audio and written journalism before, but I'd done that in the world of mixed martial arts, fight sports, kickboxing, boxing. So I had the skills to be able to do it loosely. But when I was a battery commander and the operations officer of the 4th Regiment, which is an artillery regiment in Townsville, Australia, belonged to 3rd Brigade, I was living in the mess for a while, whilst my family had moved on to the next posting location. And I was the artillery regiment officer, so I was the grumpy guy. I was the guy always saying no or yes, and or not really saying yes often. Making all the plans, making sure everyone fell in line with the commander's intent. So in the mess at night, eating the dinner, lieutenants would either come and ask me questions, or as I call it, pester me with questions. And generally, I told them there's only 3 things I wanted to talk about: 1, the food quality; 2, gunnery, and 3, the latest trends in warfare. And then one night I had a young lieutenant, I'll call him Larry, to make him anonymous. He came up to me and he interrupted me in the mess, and wanted to have a chat. And I think I was listening probably to a podcast at the time, and he let me know that he was reading On War by Clausewitz, and he knew that I had a copy in my office and that it had tabs all through it, and he wanted to talk about it. And I said, "That's fantastic, Larry. What translation are you reading? Because that can really shape your opinion." And he said, "I'm listening to the abridged audiobook." I said, "Larry, go to the bar and buy me a beer. And beers are on you tonight because you're not reading On War. You're listening to some clown read it." And we had a bit of a laugh, and we had a really good discussion about what he'd learned so far that night. I'd continued to make a few jabs at him about listening to the audiobook, which ironically is something I used to do anyway. At the time, I just didn't do it for history. I used it for a lot of fiction. But then the next day, call it a hangover, call it subunit commander guilt. I thought, wow, that lieutenant really reached out. And, we had a great discussion, but the one thing that I didn't do was support his mode of learning. And by not doing that, I wasn't recognizing one key thing. These texts and books weren't written in a way that is accessible for a lot of people. Junior officers are generally very, very busy individuals because people like who I was at the time made sure they were tasked. But also with the revolution in technology, computer software, iPods, this was 2015, everyone was walking around with headphones in their head wherever they could on base without breaking regulations. The even I at times would sit in the mess and have a drink listening to something of an evening because it's quite nice in tropical Queensland. So that got me thinking about how do I fix that? And then I went on to my next posting where I was going on to run the digital engagement for the Australian Army. And I knew that if anyone was going to come after me for doing something like starting a podcast, it would be me. So I would have been protected because the policy person in the Army who would police that would be me. And I obviously wasn't going to police myself. But I'd been given one rule from my wife because I'd been studying ever since I'd come back from Afghanistan and I'd started to bank up a few degrees. She'd said that, you're taking the year off study next year because she was starting a PhD and we really needed to juggle the workload at the house. And I was like, that's great. And then I asked her, could you teach me how to record a podcast properly? Because she's a creative industries professional. And she said, I could. Why? And I said, because I kind of launched and announced one on social media yesterday. So you kind of have to say yes now. And to her credit, she taught me how to do it, and she did the voiceover for this show, and she does the voiceover for the other productions that you and I are involved in. And then so that's kind of how it was born. The Deb and the Deb Prussian, obviously named because of cloud suits, and Harry had triggered me to have that idea. But I also need to get some advice. So before I recorded my first episode, I sat down with Claire O'Neill, who runs the Ground of Curiosity, and I said, "Hey, Claire, I've announced this project. I actually don't know if it's got." If it's going to go very well. And Claire had done some podcasts with Ground of Curiosity. So we had a great chat. I got some great advice from Claire on how to navigate that tricky part of being a current serving officer and also putting yourself out there. And then finally, the final person who I got some advice, and it was upon launch after my first episode, I spoke with Ryan Evans, who founded the War on the Rocks online journal. And Ryan and I had worked in the same operating base in Afghanistan. Ryan was a human terrain advisor, I believe, whilst I was a joint fires cell commander. So we kind of knew each other, and he provided me some advice on his experiences with War on the Rocks. And that confirmed for me after the first episode, this might be a way to go. But I guess the main driver for me was trying to distill important lessons about war and warfare, history, current policy, actual war fighting, how armies learn, into a medium that is accessible to a wider audience, primarily aiming for junior officers, but also the broader society as well.
And here we are, 100 episodes down. When you think back at when you started this epic project, how was the reception of the show by audiences measured up to the expectations you had upon launch?
I didn't see myself still doing it 5 to 6 years later, that's for sure. I kind of expected I'd have 10 downloads, and 9 of them would be my mum, and the other would be me, or maybe even you. And I know that you were I know you were in one of the first 10 downloads. But it was, I didn't think it would take off. And I had a plan. I had a multi-stage sort of plan of having various types of episodes to cover off on that initial period of testing out what audiences would actually want. Do they want interviews, or do they just want me reading things about battles? Do they want book reviews? And the very first episode I recorded and played it to my wife, who's an expert in this sort of area. She said, who's your target audience? I said, well, it's mainly people that don't normally access this material. Younger officers, policymakers, academics. And she said, cool, you need to delete this because this is a really good cure for insomnia. And you know what? Blunt advice is often the best advice. And I did. I deleted that episode. Didn't even save it on hard drive, I don't think. I think it just went. And I even had orchestral music at the start. So it was really weird. So that's kind of what I thought. And so we record the first episode. First episode was pretty popular, but the first episode I hate because it's literally just me talking about what I plan to do with the show, like many podcast first episodes are. And then the second episode happened with Vanya Eftimova Bellinger, who's a great friend now, and she took a chance on this unknown show about her book on Marie von Clausewitz. We talked about, the Marie von Clausewitz, the driving force behind the publication of Big Carl's work. and it kind of went from there. And that's when, Ryan and I chatted, and I was just like, Ryan, how do I do this? And it's grown, but I missed the target audience. So what I found was the gap that I thought I had identified, I actually was delivering a medium that was suitable for my own cohort and generation. So I had a lot of senior level majors, a lot of field rank officers, people going into command, a lot of academics who were established academics, policymakers who were established. For a short period of time, I had a Prime Minister of Australia listening to it. Never provided me any feedback, though, unfortunately. And that's why the party room kicked him out, I'm sure. But, so it was really interesting that I'd missed that target audience, and also exceptionally disappointing. In fact, I caught up with Larry. That same year on an exercise, and I said, how's life, Larry? And Larry's like, your show. I listened to your show, and it's great. And I'm like, that's excellent, Larry. I really, really sort of had you in mind when I developed it. I haven't told him he's the inspiration for it because I don't want him to claim ownership. But yeah, I said, is it helping you engage with the material at all? He said, well, I don't need to engage with the material anymore. I just need to listen to your show. Like, Larry, that's not the point. So I felt a little less guilty about that night. We got drunk in the mess where I made jokes about his listening to audiobooks. It might be that Larry was just a little bit lazy anyway. But yeah, so I didn't hit the target audience. I hit a fantastic audience. Everyone who listens to the show, very, very grateful for them. And they made the show successful. But then I had to branch out. And that's where War for Idiots was born because, as you know the story, the listeners won't, you were one of my first listeners of the Dead Prussian. You're the first person to call me up and say, hey, this is what I love about your show. These are the bits I don't love about your show. This is awesome. And then, the following year, you said, hey, should we do something together? And I said, I think we need to do something that's funny. And you said, unfortunately, you're not very funny, Mick, so figure out something.
That'll be a challenge.
And then that's how War for Idiots was born, which was largely driven, you sort of formatted the show, and then and I shaped, I suppose, where we thought the audience would be, and it's turned out to be quite a success as well. So I was kind of happy because Dead Prussian we finally hit the audience I was aiming for, but it wasn't actually with the Dead Prussian. The Dead Prussian just set up the conditions to allow it, but found itself its own niche, which has made it far more successful than I expected. But also with that comes now I have to keep the thing going.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's interesting how this expansion needed to occur to meet that target audience that Larry in the mess had inspired you to meet many years ago. But what are some of the other major challenges that you have found in producing digital content?
I suppose some of this is tied to where I was at when I started as well. So being a professional military officer, there's obviously caveats. If you work for the public, there's certain things you can and cannot do. So there are always the challenges making sure I was in line with policy, but I was very good to make sure that I engaged with the right people. I was I was supported by the chain of command. I was lucky enough to work within the Chief of Army's Chief of Staff branch at the time. So I was known not to be someone who was out there to damage the reputation of the Army. And my good looks also helped the Army out quite a bit. But also, when engaging with people, making sure that, when I interviewed Major General Mick Ryan, making sure that, I interviewed him in a way that was both appropriate for the audience, but also appropriate for anyone that understood it was a major interviewing a brigadier at the time. So that was a challenge. But so guest engagement's always been interesting. And as I've left regular service, and now I still just do some reserve time, it's been a little bit easier for guest engagement because I can be a little bit more freer. I can get a little bit more controversial, but also what I have found really challenging is the gender balance. So we have a gender policy on the show that we find it very difficult to meet, and it's not because there aren't enough women or enough women in the field that we interview, because we interview a broad range of topics. So it's not one particular field. But what I have found is when engaging with female academics, primarily female academics, and non-binary, and I don't think we've had a non-binary guest on the show. There's been a couple I've reached out to, but it just hasn't happened. They are very busy because it's it's so much harder, I have found, and the workload that they have, particularly those that have families and their emotional labour costs they have compared to their male colleagues is so different. And there's been some really difficult times when I've reached out to potential guests that are women and said, hey, I'd really love to have you on the show. And then they've referred me, oh, here's a male colleague of mine. I think that'd be really good for your show. And I've come back and said, I don't want to interview them right now. I might, but I actually just want to interview you. So that's been really hard. And, I'll put my hand on my heart and say we're not actually hitting the gender balance that we've set for the show, which is 50-50 male, female. And also we want to include non-binary as well in that. And so we'll probably have to split it, but I've got to work out the ratios. And then I guess the final one is something that, anyone in Australia has experienced when you do something that other people can notice. I know there's a saying that General Petraeus says about, the time that his time in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons was that, the higher up the flagpole you climb, the more your ass the world can see. Not necessarily suggesting I was climbing a very high flagpole, but in Australia, there's this thing called the tall poppy syndrome. So if you do something different, if you stand out in some way, you're going to come under attacks. So it took me a long time to understand the difference between my persona and people being critical of the show and the interviewer, Mick, versus people just having a go as if they knew me. So you do receive criticism. I don't receive it that much. Again, this is something I find interesting. Female colleagues of mine who try and do the same thing receive a lot of trolling. I don't receive trolling much at all. But whilst I was in the military, there'd be people who'd be like, oh, you think you know everything because you run that show. I'm like, well, if you listen to the show, all I do is ask questions. I don't give anyone new knowledge. I'm an interviewer. People don't accuse journalists of being the expert in the field. It's the expert in the field that I have on the show. So that was hard to come to terms with. And then I suppose the final big challenge for me was I had operational related psychological, post-operational related psychological issues, in 2018, which made that year really tough for me. And because of this, this idea of putting yourself out there in this very public way, it felt like when I was going through the recovery that all my listeners' eyes were on me. And in actual fact, I don't think many of the listeners would have even noticed. There was just a pause in recording and releasing for about 4 months whilst I got better. I was quite lucky. The system looked after me very, very well. So that was a big challenge, though, and that's what actually helped me, was going through that stage and then realising when I released my first episode after that period, that hiatus, that the listeners were still there and there was no judgment or criticism that I hadn't been there. So the pressure was released. So the pressure comes off. So these sorts of projects are great, but I guess I always encourage people, and I work with people to deliver projects, but also providing some of those challenges to them is very, very important, particularly the ones where you take on a burden emotionally where you actually don't need to, because you'll find that your listeners are quite forgiving. My listeners are extremely forgiving in terms of jokes, audio content, in terms of quality and release schedules. The trick is to make sure that if you're doing this type of show, as you know, with your program Behind the Black Belt, the trick is to have good guests. That is it. Because all of my shortcomings are completely wiped out by a bloody good guest.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many would have stuck around to the 100th episode of Mick Cook. You're absolutely right. But Mick, in this journey to get to your 100th episode of The Dead Prussian, it must have provided you with many opportunities to engage with vast degrees of different audiences. What do you think is the greatest benefit that you have found in embarking down this path and this journey?
I'll give a word for the greatest benefit, and then I think I might be able to explain the opportunities that it's built out. So, and you will have seen this in some of your successes as well, that the network is the greatest success. Or the best benefit I have. The friendships I've made through that network, the knowledge I've gained from the show itself is amazing. I'm super intelligent now. No, just kidding. But I'm like one of those pub trivia. One of those pub trivia, know-it-alls just on warfare topics, because I just happen to, interview people. We've had an episode on the conquistador. Conquest of Aztec Mexico, right? So that's just not topics people normally come into contact with. And my contact with that topic is primarily that interview. I haven't really read much about it in my life. So that's really interesting, like the bits of knowledge you gain. And I don't gain them in depth, but you gain these bits. But the network and the friendships I've made has enabled some amazing things. Working with the Strategy Bridge founder, Nate Finney, to build the Australian Drink and Think platform was amazing, and a lot of that was enabled through the Dead Prussian. Job opportunities. I work at the University of New South Wales Defence Research Institute. A lot of that role that I have now is because of my public engagement and network, that I'm able to connect academics and have a demonstrated record in showing how academics work can be connected to real world problems, because a lot of people just assume academics don't work in the real world. The fact is they do, and they do a lot of real world. They have a lot of real world impact. It's just that connecting people helps. So I've benefited quite a lot professionally. Personally, I feel quite fulfilled that people actually, they're very interested in this. You get a bit of an ego boost when people tell you it's a good episode. When you get a 5-star review, and it's like you're just smiling all day, right? Because you're like, wow, someone likes me. You're like that, you're like a primary school playground. Oh, you guys want to hang out with me? But I guess the final one is the establishment of TDP Studios, where we're starting to deliver a broader range of digital content. The War for Idiots as a comedy show has been brilliant. Behind the Black Belt, which is the show you produce and I assist on, is a step into a different field from anything we've produced before, and it's going very, very well. So it's amazing to see that. With TDP Studios, my next project for TDP Studios will be a history, not a war-focused podcast, more of a politics-focused podcast, which will be quite good. And then I guess finally, the business I run, Discover, Create, Learn, where I get to work with professionals and use creative techniques. And sometimes I get them to record their own podcast about their jobs, which they think is really boring, but it helps them think about their jobs. We don't publish it. But, we use lots of other creative techniques, gaming, drama, writing workshops. That program largely was built from what I had learned doing this work with TDP Studios that started with this podcast. And it's grown into a creative practice sort of business for me, which is amazing, right? Because if you enjoy what you do for a profession, then you never work a day in your life. So at the moment, I probably work, 4 days a week, and then the 5th day is probably, I do the thing I want to do. But, those are the sorts of benefits I've had. And all of this has been built around the network that I've been able to build and work with, and just these impressive people. They're far more impressive than me and far more impressive than I'll ever be. But because they're interested in the content that I'm delivering, I get to hang out with them, and sometimes I get to help them with problems they may have.
It's a great description of this thing that you started, in your backyard, in your living room, and how much it's grown. And the beauty of it being new media is anyone can go and listen to that first episode of the Dead Prussian and just see what's grown and spawned off it. It's very inspirational, very interesting, and quite inspiring for myself. But now that the flagship of your podcasting empire, I'm not sure who wrote this question, but now of the podcasting empire has hit 100 episodes, what's next? What's next for the Dead Prussian podcast?
It's interesting because when I saw that someone had written this question, I went back over a loose sketch I drew on a notepad to have a chat with you in 2017 when we were building the idea for War for Idiots. And it had a whole heap of things on there. And I actually looked at it, and we've hit 3 out of the 4 goals. But the 4th goal is not going to happen. So for those listeners that don't know, like I studied criminology for a while I was injured. And I was thinking of doing a true crime podcast, but oh my God, that market is done. So I just want to confirm for listeners that there are no plans for a true crime podcast from TDP Studios at the moment. Look, the Dead Prussian's got to move into publications. We're starting to work our transcripts in a way that we'll be able to provide them to the community in different formats, which is good because I know that a lot of uni students get criticised for quoting podcasts. I know that we've had a mixed reaction. We had people at the Australian War College that have been given both thumbs up and a thumbs down on using podcast material and quoting experts I've had on the show. I know that Corey Shockey, when she ran a course at Stanford, she used to give people a bonus amount of marks if they quoted an expert from the Dead Prussian podcast. So being able to make those transcripts of the episodes of the experts accessible in a way that's also acceptable for people to be able to use in different manners, because whilst new media is great, there's still some people who rely on the traditional media aspects. The TDP community, which is our bespoke social media network, I've had to limit certain plans on it because it's going so well. We have to we've limited how long people can sign up for because we to make sure that it's a sustainable model. So people can sign up for a day for free. They can sign up for a nominal fee for a month, or they can sign up for a year. So that's going really, really well. It's great to see the workshops we do there. So we do writing workshops, we do book discussions, we do historical event discussions, we have a forum where we chat, and we just connect and talk. And building a community like that's quite good. There is, as I mentioned before, there's another podcast coming that was put on hold recently while I helped a mate out with his own project. No surprises who that was. Someone who's always been able to convince me to go into the next idea. But there will be, so in 2021, we'll be launching a new podcast. It'll be a very different format, be a very different topic. It'll be in an area where I think the market's probably saturated, but I looked at all these people being successful in it and I said, me too. So we'll see how that goes in 2021. And look, I think we will continue the Dead Prussian podcast because it's just, at the moment, people are listening. When people stop listening, we'll stop the show. Or if I get bored, I'll stop the show. But let's just say when people stop listening, we'll stop the show.
So, Mick, my final question is one that I ask all guests on the Dead Prussian, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the Dead Prussian himself, did. I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So, Mick Cook of this podcast, for which we now record, I ask you to finish this sentence. War is.
So I was going to try and avoid this one because I was worried that if I answer it, that's the
end. It's a full stop.
But I've quite recently spent 8 weeks working with a young group of junior officers on defining war, and I figured out that you can argue with anyone about it. So I was going to say war is undefinable, and then ching, and everyone's like, yeah, great, 100th episode, roll out the red carpet. But that's not going to work. So I've written one down, which I think is a little bit wordy, but I like it. War is the abject failure of humanity to realize its potential. And that, everyone gets to explain their sentence when they explain it. I'm not going to. That's my sentence. War is the abject failure of humanity to realize its potential.
Well, like a good movie or like a good book, if something isn't explained up front and you think about it over and over again, and it provides more questions than it does answers, then I think it's a good definition. Can you say it one more time for the listeners out there?
War is the abject failure of humanity to realize its potential.
So there you have it, ladies and gents. From Mick Cook, war is. Tell them what you think. And as always, throw in your 2 cents as well. So, Mick, I got to thank you so much for being on this show. I never thought I'd get to 100 episodes, and I'm so glad that I managed to secure you for the 100th. But thank you so much for the passion. Thank you so much for the drive. And I'm sure there's many a young Larry out there who thanks you for just giving it a crack. And probably he nor you thought you'd ever get to the 100th. But there's many people that enjoy listening. You've inspired many, inclusive of myself, to learn more about this thing that we're meant to be professionals within and to understand it from many, many different ways. So thank you for the work that you continue to provide to the community, the stuff that you continue to produce, add to the conversation. And most importantly, thank you for coming on and being the guest for the 100th show.
No worries, Rich. Thanks very much for your kind words. Too kind. It's probably the nicest thing you've ever said to me, but which has thrown me. But maybe, just maybe, I'll maybe listeners will hear my voice on the show one day in the future. Thanks.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gents. That is the 100th episode. Thank you again for all the support on social media, as well as all the reviews on iTunes. And a special thanks to our TDP community for their ongoing support and engagement with our content. But until next time, listeners, this is Rich saying, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.